7 brides fled this mountain. The 8th one said, "I'm not leaving." 6 women ran from Elias Mercer's mountain before winter even had a chance to show its teeth. The 7th didn't make it through her first night. Everyone in the valley said the same thing: that ridge would break any woman who tried. Then Naomi Alvarez climbed off that wagon, a seamstress from the crowded east, a woman the world had already decided didn't fit, looked straight at the man everyone pitied and the wilderness everyone feared, and said she was staying. What happened next on Bitter Ridge is the kind of story people still argue about around fire pits decades later. Stay with us until the very end. This one earns it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join our family right now so you never miss what's coming next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The marriage broker's office smelled like pipe smoke and old paper, and Hector Briggs had long since stopped pretending the smell bothered him. He sat behind his desk on a Tuesday morning in late October with a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow and a letter he had already read 4 times spread flat under his hands. It was from Elias Mercer. Again. Hector set the letter down, rubbed his face, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since the spring flood 2 years back. He'd brokered 63 marriages in 11 years of working the mountain settlements. 63. He was proud of that number. Most of them held. Most of them worked out to something decent, if not always something warm. But Elias Mercer was going to ruin his record. 6 women. 6. The first one, a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania named Dorothea, had lasted 5 days before she paid a passing trapper to carry her back down the mountain road. She'd left a note that said only, "It's too quiet up there. I can't explain it. It's just too quiet." The second bride, a widow from Ohio with 2 grown sons and no fear of hard work, had made it 11 days before a windstorm tore the barn door clean off its hinges, and she decided the wilderness was telling her something she intended to hear. Numbers 3 and 4 had arrived together. Sisters, actually, which was unusual, a twin arrangement Hector had thought was inspired. And they'd fled together on the 4th morning when they woke to find a black bear nosing around the woodpile. The 5th woman hadn't even made it to the cabin. She'd taken one look at the road disappearing into the pines at the base of the ridge and told the wagon driver to turn around right there. The 6th had lasted the longest 3 weeks, and Hector had allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic until her letter arrived explaining that she respected Mr. Mercer enormously, but that she'd decided she wanted a life with people in it. And now Elias was asking for another chance. Hector read the letter a 5th time. The handwriting was careful and small, the kind of script a man practiced when he spent most of his hours alone. "I understand if you've given up on me, Mr. Briggs. I wouldn't fault you for it. But I'm asking once more because the homestead is sound and the land is good, and I believe there is a woman somewhere who would see it that way. I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for someone who isn't either." Hector folded the letter, finished the cold coffee without tasting it, and reached for his ledger. He had one name left. One woman who'd responded to the general posting and hadn't yet been matched. He'd been hesitant about her, not because of anything wrong with her character, which seemed solid from her letters, but because she was different from the profile he'd typically placed up in the mountain settlements, and he'd worried she might be setting herself up for a harder kind of disappointment. Her name was Naomi Alvarez. She was 30 years old, a seamstress, and she'd spent the last decade working in a garment shop in a city so crowded she'd told him in her first letter that she could stand on her front step and count 40 people without moving her feet. She was, by her own description, a heavy-set woman. "I am not a small person, Mr. Briggs, and I have no patience for pretending otherwise." And she'd lost her employment when the shop closed and her landlord raised the rent on the same week in March. She'd written to Hector not out of desperation. She'd been clear about that, but out of what she called a practical reckoning. "I've been in the city my whole life, and I've never once felt like it was mine," she'd written. "I don't know what the wilderness is like, but I know what a crowded room full of people who don't see you feels like, and I'm willing to trade that for something honest, even if honest is hard." Hector had liked that letter. He'd liked all of her letters. She wrote plainly and she thought clearly, and she didn't seem to carry the kind of romantic ideas about frontier life that had contributed to at least 3 of Elias's previous failures. He wrote to her that afternoon. She wrote back within the week. 3 weeks later, she was in a wagon heading north toward Bitter Ridge. The driver's name was Cal Whitmore, and he'd made the mountain run enough times to know that silence was a courtesy on the upper road. The pass got narrow above the tree line, and the mules didn't like the wind that came off the ridge in October. And he'd learned that passengers who tried to make cheerful conversation up there generally ended up unnerving themselves as much as the animals. But the woman sitting behind him, Naomi Alvarez, the latest Mercer bride, Lord help her, had barely said 10 words since they'd left the staging town at dawn. And it wasn't the anxious kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet that came from someone paying attention. He'd felt her eyes moving across the terrain, the way the pines thickened on the eastern slope, the way the creek appeared and disappeared below the road, the way the sky sat low and gray and purposeful over the upper peaks. About 2 hours out from the cabin, Cal decided he owed her the truth. "Miss Alvarez," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "Naomi," she said. "Naomi." He cleared his throat. "I've carried 6 women up this road before you. I want you to know that so you don't hear it from someone else and feel blindsided." There was a pause. "I know," she said. "Mr. Briggs told me." "He did?" "He did. 6 women. 5 days was the longest, I think, or close to it." 3 weeks, Cal corrected. "Last one made it 3 weeks." 3 weeks, Naomi repeated. She didn't sound rattled by the correction. "Did any of them seem wrong to you? When you were carrying them up, did you think that one won't last?" Cal thought about it honestly. He owed her that much. "The first one," he said finally. "She kept asking me how far to the nearest town. Not the nearest settlement, the nearest real town, with a hotel and a milliner's shop. That one I knew. The others," he shook his head. "The others surprised me." "Why did they leave? The ones that surprised you?" "Different reasons. Cold, loneliness. One was the bear." He paused. "I think mostly it was him. Mercer. He's not a mean man, not even a difficult one exactly. But he's been alone up there so long he doesn't really know how to be with somebody. Doesn't talk much. Doesn't fill the room, if you understand me. Some women need a room filled." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "What's the cabin like?" she asked. Cal blinked. In 11 trips up this road, 6 up, 5 back with crying women in their trunks, not one of them had asked him about the cabin. "Solid," he said. "He built it himself over about 4 years. Stone foundation, which is more than most up here have. Gets the wind off the north face sometimes, but it holds. He's added to it twice. Has a proper kitchen now, separate from the main room." "What direction does the door face?" "East," he said, after thinking. "East, I believe. Why?" "Morning light," she said simply. Cal didn't have anything to add to that. Elias Mercer heard the wagon before he saw it. He'd been splitting wood on the side of the cabin that caught the afternoon sun. What little sun there was in October up here. And he stopped with the axe mid-swing when the sound of iron wheels on the frozen ruts reached him through the trees. He set the axe down slowly. He didn't go to the road. He'd learned by now that going to the road felt too much like hoping, and he'd trained himself out of that particular habit after the 4th time it ended with him watching a wagon disappear back the way it came. He heard Cal's voice, low and even, talking the mules through the last narrow turn. He heard the wagon stop. He heard boots on the frozen ground. And then he picked up the axe again because his hands needed something to do, and he walked around the corner of the cabin to where the yard opened up toward the road. She was standing in the middle of the yard. She wasn't what he'd expected. Not that he'd let himself picture much. He'd stopped doing that too, for the same reason he'd stopped going to the road. But he'd absorbed, without meaning to, an impression from Briggs's description. A seamstress. Practical. The word heavy-set had appeared somewhere in the broker's letter, offered matter-of-factly, and Elias had read past it without particular feeling in either direction. She was a solid woman, broad-shouldered and sure-footed, standing with her hands loose at her sides and her dark hair tucked back under a wool hat that had seen better years. Her coat was good, heavy canvas, quilted at the collar, the kind of thing you bought when you planned to be outside in real weather. She was looking at the cabin, not at him, at the cabin. Her eyes moved across the roofline, the woodpile, the shed to the east, The garden beds that were dead and frosted over, but still visible as garden beds if you knew what to look for. She was reading the place. That was what it looked like. Like she was reading it the way a person reads a letter they want to understand before they respond. Then she looked at him. He walked toward her. He was aware of the axe in his hand, and he set it against the cabin wall as he came around the corner, though he didn't know why that felt important. Elias Mercer, he said. Naomi Alvarez, she said. They stood about 10 feet apart. The wind came off the ridge with that particular October edge to it, the kind that meant business. Elias looked at her, and she looked at him, and he couldn't tell what she thought. She had a steady, level face, not unfriendly, but not performing anything either. She wasn't smiling the nervous smile he'd seen on every other woman who'd come up this road, the one that meant, please don't be as bad as I'm afraid you might be. She just looked at him, like she was reading him the same way she'd read the cabin. Behind her, Cal was unloading her trunk from the wagon bed. He caught Elias's eye briefly and gave a small shrug that meant, don't ask me, she's a mystery. I should tell you, Elias started, because he'd decided after the sixth woman that he would stop pretending the situation was normal. That 6 women have come up this road before you. I don't say that to... I'm not proud of it. I say it because you should know what you're walking into. I know, she said. Briggs told you. Briggs told me. The driver told me again on the road. She paused. I figure 3 times is probably enough. He almost said something and then didn't. She turned and looked at the mountain above the tree line, the granite faces just visible between the upper pines, gray and enormous against the gray sky. She looked at it for a long moment. Not with fear, not with admiration either particularly, more the way you'd look at something you were sizing up, something you were deciding about. Then she turned back to him. I'm not here to visit, she said. I'm here to stay. It was such a plain sentence, no flourish, no defiance, no edge, just a statement of fact, offered the same way she might have said the trunk is heavy or I take my coffee without sugar. And yet it landed somewhere in Elias's chest with a weight he hadn't expected, because every other woman who'd come up this road had brought a version of hope with them, anxious, brittle, performative hope, and he'd watched all of it break against the reality of the mountain. This woman wasn't bringing hope. She was bringing a decision. All right, he said. Cal finished with the trunk, tipped his hat at Naomi, gave Elias a look that said good luck, sincerely, and climbed back onto the wagon seat. The mules turned without much encouragement. The wagon moved back down the road into the pines. Elias and Naomi stood in the yard in the October wind as the sound of the wheels faded. I'd like to see inside, she said. Of course, he said. He picked up one end of the trunk without asking, and she picked up the other end without being asked, and together they carried it through the cabin door. The interior was better than she'd expected in some ways, and exactly what she'd expected in others. The stone foundation Cal had mentioned was solid. She could feel that in the floor beneath her boots. No soft spots, no give. The kitchen addition was real and functional. A wood stove with a wide, flat cooking surface, and a good chimney draw, judging by the smoke pulling clean and straight out the top. The main room was large by frontier standards, with 2 windows that faced east and south respectively, which meant decent natural light in the morning and through the early afternoon. But it was a man's space. Not messy exactly. Elias was clearly not someone who let things decay, but arranged with pure function in mind, with no acknowledgement that comfort was a thing that existed. The blankets on the bed were stacked rather than folded. The table was positioned for eating, not for anything else. There was a single chair by the stove that was worn smooth on one side from years of the same body sitting in it. One chair. Naomi noticed that and didn't comment on it. She set her end of the trunk down and straightened up and looked around the room slowly, cataloging. There was a draft coming from the north wall. She could feel it on her face before she could see where it came from. She moved toward it, ran her palm along the logs, found the gap. It wasn't enormous, but in a month it would be. In 2 months, it would be a problem. This needs chinking, she said. I know, he said. I've been meaning to get to it. She nodded. She didn't say, well, why haven't you? She just noted it. The woodpile looks good, she said. 4 cords, he said. I aim for 5, but 4 is enough if the winter runs normal. What does normal mean up here? First real snow in November, deep through January and February. March is unpredictable. You can get blizzards in March that are worse than anything midwinter, or you can get early thaw. What was last year? He looked at her. Late thaw. Didn't clear the high road until April. Did you have enough wood? Just barely. She turned away from the north wall and looked at him. Then 5 cords, she said, not 4. He held her gaze for a moment. There was something in his expression that was hard to read. Not offense, not quite that. Something more like surprise, like he was trying to figure out what kind of thing she was. All right, he said, for the second time. Outside, the wind shifted and the pines moved on the ridge above them with a sound like a wave coming in, that deep, sustained rush that the mountain made when it was testing the air. Naomi listened to it for a moment, then turned and opened her trunk. Is there a second chair somewhere? She asked. There wasn't. He had to bring one in from the shed. It had 3 legs and a cracked back, and he told himself he'd fix it last spring and hadn't. He set it across the table from his own chair, wobbling slightly. I can fix that, he said. I can fix it too, she said, pulling her sewing kit from the top of the trunk. I'll do it tonight. He watched her for a moment. She was moving around the space the way someone moves when they're already thinking 3 steps ahead. Not rushing, not performing competence, just working. He thought about the 6 women before her. He thought about Dorothea from Pennsylvania and her question about the hotel with the milliner's shop. He thought about the widow from Ohio who'd packed her trunk so fast he'd offered to help her, and she'd said, "No thank you. I've gotten faster at this than I'd like." He thought about the quiet he'd come home to every single time after Cal's wagon disappeared. He picked up his own coat from the hook by the door. I'll start on the 5th cord, he said. Naomi didn't look up from the trunk. Take the axe that's leaning against the left side of the building, she said. The one on the right has a loose head. I saw it when we walked in. He stopped in the doorway. He looked back at her, and she was pulling a folded piece of canvas from the trunk, not looking at him, already somewhere else in her thinking. Elias walked outside into the October wind. He picked up the axe on the left side. He swung the axe that first evening until the light failed completely, and when he came inside, Naomi had the 3-legged chair repaired, a pot of something on the stove that smelled like onions and dried venison, and the north wall gap packed with a tight strip of layered canvas she'd cut from what looked like an old bag at the bottom of her trunk. He stood in the doorway and looked at the wall. That'll hold through the season, she said, without turning from the stove. It's not pretty, but it's tight. I used a double layer with the seams offset so the wind can't find a straight path through. He didn't say anything for a moment. He'd been meaning to chink that gap since August. Where'd you learn that? He asked. Drafty apartments, she said. You'd be surprised what a city tenement teaches you about keeping cold air out. He washed his hands in the basin by the door and sat down at the table. She set 2 bowls down, his chair and the repaired chair across from him, which was now sitting level and solid on all 3 legs, plus a 4th she'd fashioned from a piece of hardwood she'd found in the wood box and shaped with his carving knife. You fixed the leg, he said. It was just a matter of finding the right angle. She sat down. Eat while it's hot. Dried meat doesn't improve when it cools. The stew wasn't remarkable. The dried venison was tough in the way dried venison always was, and she'd used too much salt, which she seemed to know because she made a face at her first spoonful and said, I oversalted it. I'll calibrate the stores tomorrow. I wasn't sure what you had. But it was hot, and it was food, and Elias ate all of it, which was more than he could say for the meals the second bride had cooked. She'd had delicate sensibilities about frontier ingredients and had mostly produced things he could describe only as intentions. They ate in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence, particularly. Just quiet. The well, Naomi said eventually. How deep? 22 feet. Good water. Doesn't dry up even in late summer. Does it freeze? The top can crust over in January, but it breaks easy enough. I keep a rod hanging by the shed door. She nodded, filing it away. The closest neighbor? She asked. Connell family, 3 miles east along the Ridge Road. Boyd Connell, his wife Vera, 2 boys. Have they been friendly? Elias was quiet for a beat. Vera is.
he said. Boyd. Boyd's all right. He keeps to himself mostly. Naomi looked at him over her bowl. She had a way of looking at him that wasn't aggressive but wasn't going to be deflected either. It was the look of someone who had learned that the thing people didn't quite say was usually more important than the thing they did. And, she said. And he's made some comments, Elias said, about Briggs sending women up here, about why they leave, about you. Mostly about me, lately about the arrangement in general. He set his spoon down. You should know that people in the valley think they think I'm foolish for trying again. That's the polite version of what they think. Naomi looked back at her bowl. What's the impolite version? That nobody suitable will ever choose this life. That the only women who'd answer a posting for a mountain homestead are either desperate or don't know any better. He paused. That's also the version that includes more specific opinions about what kind of woman would still be unmarried at 30 and willing to come this far. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. I've heard those opinions before, Naomi said. Her voice was flat and even. Not hurt. Not performing toughness either, just factual. I've been hearing versions of that my whole life. You don't have to soften them for me. I wasn't softening them. You were. A little. She looked up at him again. I'm a fat woman who was working in a garment shop for 10 years because it was the only place that hired fat women without argument. I've heard every version of that opinion there is. It doesn't change what I'm doing here. Elias looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. It was becoming something of a pattern between them. Him saying all right when he meant something larger that he didn't have the language for yet. She started clearing the bowls. He moved to help, and she let him, which was different from some arrangements he'd heard about where the division of labor became a kind of territory, everything defended. She washed, and he dried, and they put things away in a kitchen that was slowly, almost without either of them acknowledging it, rearranging itself around two people instead of one. He showed her where extra blankets were kept, in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. He'd thought about the sleeping arrangement more than he'd admitted to himself. The cabin had one room and one bed, which was simply the practical reality of a homestead built by a man alone, and he'd told himself he'd address it when the time came, and the time had now come, and he found he didn't quite know how to begin. I can sleep in the chair, he said, until you're comfortable. There's no expectation that... Elias, she said. Yes. We're adults. She pulled two of the blankets from the chest and handed half to him. The bed's big enough. You sleep on your side and I'll sleep on mine, and if that arrangement needs to change, then we'll discuss it when it needs to change. He took the blankets. All right, he said. She almost smiled at that. He caught the edge of it before she turned away. The first week was an exercise in two people learning the geography of each other without maps. Elias rose before light, which she matched without complaint, though he could tell from the particular set of her face in those first dark mornings that she was not naturally a person who greeted the pre-dawn with enthusiasm. She did it anyway. She got up, she got dressed, she started the stove, and she did all of it with the grim competence of someone who had made a decision and intended to honor it regardless of how the decision felt at 5 a.m. He was up on the roof checking the north side shingles on the third day when he heard her moving around in the shed below. He'd told her the shed contained tools, the extra harness for the mule, and miscellaneous items he hadn't sorted since the spring. What he hadn't expected was to come down 2 hours later and find the shed reorganized. Not drastically, not in a way that disrupted his system, but with the kind of quiet, logical adjustment that made him realize his system had never quite been a system at all. The tools were hung by type and frequency of use. The harness was cleaned and properly coiled. The miscellaneous items had been sorted into 3 groups: useful, probably useful, and taking up space. I didn't move anything without being sure where it went, she said, coming around from behind the shed with an armload of rusted hinges she'd pulled from the third pile. If I got it wrong, tell me and I'll put it back. You didn't get it wrong, he said. She nodded and went back to what she was doing. On the 5th day, she found the vegetable garden. It was a poor thing. He knew that. It had been a poor thing since he'd established it 3 years back.
yielding enough to supplement, but never enough to matter, and he'd told himself the problem was the soil on the south side of the cabin where he'd put it. Naomi walked the garden beds in the cold morning light, crouching down in a few places to look at the soil more closely, and then she stood and looked at the angle of the sun clearing the tree line, and she said without preamble, "You've got the garden in the wrong spot." He came to stand beside her. "The south side gets the most sun." "In summer it does. But look at the shadow line from the pines. You're losing light by 2 in the afternoon from June on. The east side of the cabin gets morning sun and doesn't lose it until nearly 4. It's better ground for growing." She paused. "Also, the south side is where your cold air pools. It settles down from the ridge and sits in that low corner. You're fighting the temperature every season without knowing it." He looked at the garden. He looked at the east side of the cabin. He thought about 3 years of disappointing yields and told himself he should have seen it. "Moving a garden in November," he said. "Not November. In the spring. We plant it now. Move it when the ground breaks." She looked at him. "I'm not criticizing. I see these things. Sewing teaches you to look at how light falls on material. It's the same principle." "You're criticizing," he said. She stopped. "Yes. A little. I'll try to be less direct about it." "Don't," he said. "I'd rather know." She studied him for a moment as if recalibrating something. "All right then," she said. "Your water collection is also poorly sited. And the mule needs his left rear shoe looked at. He's favoring it slightly. I noticed when you brought him in yesterday." Elias looked at her. "Anything else?" he said. "The door hinges need oil," she said, "but that's minor." He went and checked the mule's shoe that afternoon. She was right. There was a small crack in the iron on the outside edge that, left another 2 weeks, would have lamed the animal. He didn't tell her she was right about the shoe. She didn't ask. But that evening, when he sat down to supper, he said, "I'm taking him to the farrier in Aldervale on Friday." And she said, "Good." And that was sufficient. Though what they were building in those first weeks was not romance. It was something more practical and in some ways more durable than romance. It was a working understanding of each other, of how the other person moved through a problem, of what they needed and what they could manage without. He learned that she worked best with her hands when something was troubling her. On the days when something had gone wrong or sat badly with her, she'd pull out her sewing or take up a task with her hands and work through it that way, coming out the other side quieter and more settled. He learned not to push conversation on those days. She learned that his silences were not coldness, that the man who had been described to her as emotionally distant was not, in fact, distant. He simply didn't perform feeling the way people expected. He showed up. He did the work. When she dropped a full pot of water crossing the icy yard one morning and it splashed over her legs and she swore loud enough to startle the mule, he was beside her in a moment, steady and practical, helping her inside and checking her legs for the burn before she'd even registered that she was embarrassed. He didn't make anything of it. He just dealt with it. She appreciated that more than she expected to. The cold deepened through November and the first real snow came early, coating the ridge in 6 inches on a Thursday morning and sealing the high road until the following week. They were not cut off, not yet, not truly, but the mountain was showing them its intentions, and they both understood it. It was also when the trappers started appearing. The first one came on a Friday. His name was Rudy Hask, and he ran a line up the north side of the ridge and had apparently made a habit for several years of stopping at Mercer's cabin when his route brought him nearby, on the understanding that Elias would share coffee and news from the valley. He was a big man, weathered in the particular way of people who spent most of their time outside, with small, sharp eyes that moved to Naomi immediately when Elias let him in from the cold. "So it's true," Rudy said, pulling off his gloves. "Briggs sent another one." "This is my wife, Naomi," Elias said. "Naomi, Rudy Hask." Rudy looked at her. Not unkindly exactly, but with the open assessment of a man who had no particular instinct to hide what he was thinking. "How long you planning to stay?" he asked. The question landed in the room like something dropped on a wood floor. Elias went still. Naomi, who was pouring coffee at the stove and had her back to both of them, finished pouring and turned around. "Permanently," she said, and handed Rudy his cup. Rudy looked at her, then at Elias, then back at her. "Well," he said. All right then. He drank his coffee and talked about the snow conditions on the north face and left after about 40 minutes, and Naomi went back to the shirt she was mending and didn't bring it up again. But the next one was worse. His name was Fletcher Grouse, and he came 2 weeks later with a companion named something Naomi didn't catch. And the two of them sat at Elias's table and drank his coffee and spoke about Naomi in the third person while she was standing at the stove 8 feet away, which was a kind of cruelty she recognized well enough. The cruelty of people who've decided you're not quite real enough to address directly. Mercer, what's Briggs thinking? Fletcher said, cradling his cup. Sending a city woman up here. A woman that size isn't built for this kind of work. Elias said, Naomi works harder than anyone I've had on this property. I'm sure she does her best, Fletcher said, in the tone of a man being generous. I'm just saying, come real winter, she's going to find out what it means up here. They all do. She's standing right there, Elias said. I know she is. Fletcher glanced at her, not embarrassed, just acknowledging. No offense intended, ma'am, just being honest with your husband. Naomi turned from the stove. She looked at Fletcher Grouse with the level reading look she'd given the mountain on the first day. None taken, she said. She brought the coffee pot and refilled his cup because she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her hands shake, and she went back to the stove, and she said nothing else. But that night, after Elias had banked the fire, and she thought he was close to sleeping, she lay on her side of the bed and stared at the ceiling and felt the particular weight of it. Not the first time she'd felt it, not by a long measure, but no number of times made it lighter. The weight of being looked at and found insufficient before you'd done a single thing. The weight of being a body that other people decided was a statement before it was a person. She heard Elias shift on his side of the bed. You're awake, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm awake. A pause. Fletcher Grouse is an idiot, he said. I know. I should have said more. You said enough. She paused. You don't have to defend me to every person who comes through this door, Elias. I'm not asking for that. I'm not... He stopped. What are you asking for then? She thought about it honestly. Nothing yet, she said. I'll let you know when I figure it out. Another pause. Longer. All right, he said. She almost smiled again, there in the dark. Almost. The blizzard came in the third week of November, and it came fast. Elias saw the clouds building over the upper peaks at noon and knew immediately they had maybe 4 hours, possibly fewer. He'd spent enough winters on this ridge to read that particular sky. He came inside and found Naomi re-waterproofing the seams of their heaviest coats with tallow, and he said, without preamble, Storm's coming. Big one. I need to get the animals in and secure the south lean-to before it hits. She was already putting the coat down and standing up. Tell me what to do, she said. The lean-to. The pins on the east side have been loose all season. I need to get rope bracing across the roof before the wind hits, or we lose the whole structure. But I can't do the animals and the lean-to both in 4 hours, not alone. I'll do the animals, she said. Show me where the rope is for the lean-to and tell me what you need, and I'll start on that while you get them in. You've never braced a lean-to. I've never been in a blizzard either, she said. Show me. He showed her. He talked fast, hands moving over the rope ends, explaining the angle of the bracing and where the anchors needed to go into the frozen ground. And she listened, the way she listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, filing it. Go, she said. He went. The wind came up faster than he'd expected. By the time he had the mule and the 2 goats in the shed and the shed door braced, the first wave of snow was coming off the ridge in curtains, and he could barely see the cabin. He came around to the south side, half expecting to find the lean-to already gone, and instead found Naomi on her knees in the snow with a hand auger, driving the last anchor into the ground, her hands red with cold through her gloves, and her face set with the specific expression of someone who has decided that this is not the thing that beats them. The brace she'd rigged was not elegant. He'd have done it somewhat differently himself. But it was solid. She'd understood the load path, gotten the angles right, cross-tied at the ridgepole the way he'd described. The lean-to held through 3 days of blizzard that took shingles off the Connell place 3 miles east and dropped 8 feet of snow on the upper road. On the second night, when the wind was loud enough against the walls to make normal conversation difficult, Naomi sat close to the stove with her sewing, and Elias sat across from her reading the same page of the same almanac he'd been trying to read for 2 weeks, and the fire in the stove threw orange light across both of them. And the mountain screamed and battered at the walls, and neither of them flinched. It was, Elias thought, the first time in longer than he could exactly measure that being inside the cabin during a storm felt like something other than waiting. On the third morning, the wind dropped, and they dug out together, and the lean-to was standing, and the animals were alive, and the 5th cord of wood Elias had finished splitting, the cord Naomi had told him on the first afternoon they would need, was buried under snow but solid and dry underneath. She hadn't said "I told you so" about the wood. He appreciated that. "We lost about a quarter of the preserved onions," she said, going through the storage after they'd dug out. "The cold got into that corner of the root cellar. I want to move the winter stores to the back wall and build a secondary insulation barrier before the next storm." He was pulling ice from the water barrel. "That'll take most of a day." "Half a day if we both do it," she said. "We should do it today while it's clear." He looked at the pale winter sky through the open shed door. Clear was temporary up here. She'd learned that. She was already learning it. "Today," he agreed. They started after breakfast. It was hard, cold, awkward work, shifting heavy crocks and barrels in a low-ceilinged root cellar that had never been designed for 2 people to work in simultaneously. And they bumped into each other and got in each other's way and had a brief disagreement about whether the secondary barrier needed to be straw-packed or not. He said the straw would attract rodents. She said the rodents were already there regardless. And she was correct, which he acknowledged without quite saying so directly. By early afternoon, the stores were repositioned and the barrier was built, and the cellar was, demonstrably, warmer in the back corner than it had been. Naomi climbed up out of the cellar hatch and sat on the edge and looked at her hands. They were dirty, and one knuckle was scraped open, and she was breathing harder than she'd been. The cold air plus the exertion plus the cramped space had cost her. Elias climbed up beside her. He was carrying a cut onion from the quarter they'd salvaged, the kind of small, irrelevant thing you grab without thinking when you're closing up a root cellar. They sat on the edge of the hatch in the cold afternoon air, side by side, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. "We saved most of it," she said finally. "Most of it," he agreed. She looked at the scraped knuckle. Then she looked at the mountain. The upper peaks had fresh snow on them from the blizzard, white against the flat winter sky, enormous and indifferent and permanent. She looked at it the way she'd looked at it on the first day. Not afraid, not admiring, something more complex than either. "Is it always like this?" she asked. Elias considered the question genuinely. "No," he said. "Sometimes it's worse." She looked at him. Then she made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, a short, dry, genuine laugh, the first he'd heard from her, and it surprised him enough that he felt something loosen somewhere in his chest that he hadn't realized had been held tight. "That's honest," she said. "You asked for honest," he said. "I did," she said. "I did ask for that." She pulled herself to her feet, brushed the dirt off her coat, and went to start supper. He sat on the edge of the cellar hatch for another minute with the cut onion in his hand, listening to the mountain in the silence after the blizzard, and thought about the 6 women who had come up this road and the one who had stayed, and the laugh he'd just heard in the cold afternoon air, and how small a thing it was, and how it didn't feel small at all. Winter settled into Bitter Ridge the way it always did. Not all at once, but in layers, each one heavier than the last, until the world above the tree line became a thing of white and gray, and wind so cold it had a sound like tearing paper when it came off the peaks. December passed in work. There was always work. That was the one thing Naomi hadn't fully understood from letters and descriptions. Not the difficulty of it, which she'd expected, but the sheer relentlessness. The mountain didn't give you a day off. The animals needed feeding regardless of temperature. The water needed breaking free from ice every morning. Wood needed splitting and stacking and carrying. Food needed preserving and rationing and checking. The cabin needed constant small repairs that, left undone, became large problems. She'd known it would be hard. She hadn't known it would be this continuous, this unbroken, this utterly without pause. She didn't complain about it, partly because complaining wouldn't change it, and partly because she'd noticed that Elias watched her, not in a suspicious way, not checking for signs of weakness, but with a kind of careful attention, the way a person watches something they're not yet sure they can trust to be real. She understood that. She'd arrived carrying the weight of 6 failures before her, and no amount of good intentions was going to erase that weight quickly. She had to simply keep showing up, and she did. By January, they had developed something that functioned like a rhythm. He rose first, built up the fire, checked the animals. She started breakfast, assessed the day's most urgent needs, organized what could be organized before the cold made outdoor work miserable. They divided tasks not by discussion, but by an evolving, unspoken agreement about who was better at what. She had faster, more precise hands, so she handled anything requiring fine work. He had more raw strength and a better read of the outdoor terrain, so he led anything requiring physical force or knowledge of the mountain's moods. It wasn't a perfect system. There were days they stepped on each other and days the division broke down because both tasks were urgent simultaneously and they had to improvise. But it held, more or less. What changed in January was something else, something harder to name. It happened gradually, the way most real things do. He started telling her things, not big things at first, just the small observations of a man who'd spent years with no one to tell them to. The way the light hit the eastern peaks in late afternoon and turned the granite briefly amber. The particular creek that ran clean year-round, fed by a spring so deep it never froze. The deer trail that crossed the North Meadow and had been used by the same family of deer, he believed, for at least 3 winters, because they always moved in the same pattern, always paused in the same spot at the edge of the tree line. She listened to these things with the same quality of attention she gave to everything, complete, unhurried. She asked questions that weren't performative, real questions, the kind that revealed she'd actually been thinking about what he said. "Why do you think it's the same family?" she asked, about the deer. "The lead doe has a notch in her left ear. Coyote, probably. Years back. I've seen her 3 winters now. And she comes back to the same place. She knows it's safe." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "That's actually a reasonable strategy," she said. "Returning to what's safe. Returning to what you know won't kill you," she said. "It's not the same thing as settling. It's just practical." He looked at her. She was mending a wool sock by firelight, not looking up, and he couldn't tell if she was talking about the deer. He thought she might not be talking only about the deer. These were the conversations they had in January, while the mountain pressed down on the cabin with the full weight of its winter. Conversations that started in one place and ended somewhere neither of them had entirely intended. He was not a man who'd ever talked easily, and she wasn't a woman who wasted words, and somehow that compatibility of restraint produced something between them that was more honest than most. He told her one evening in the middle of January about the first bride. He hadn't intended to. They were eating supper and she'd mentioned Hector Briggs in passing, something about a letter she was drafting to him about the spring seed order. And Elias had said something about Briggs being a good man who'd been more patient with him than he deserved, and then he found himself talking about Dorothea from Pennsylvania, the school teacher. How she'd sat at this same table on her first evening and held her coffee cup with both hands and asked him, in a voice that was trying to be light, what the nearest lending library was. How he'd told her there wasn't one within 40 miles. How her face had done something very small and very fast that she'd immediately controlled, but he'd seen it. She was a smart woman, he said. She read everything. She'd brought 4 books in her trunk, and I think she rationed them out like food, a chapter a day, to make them last. He paused. I didn't have any books. I hadn't thought about it. I should have thought about it. Naomi looked at him across the table. You couldn't have kept her either way, she said. The books weren't the reason. I know that. But you still feel bad about the books. He was quiet. Yes, he said. Naomi nodded slowly. I brought 11 books, she said, in the bottom of the trunk under the canvas. If you want to read any of them, you're welcome to. He looked at her. You packed books? I packed books, she said. I packed books and an extra awl and a good oil stone for your knives, which I noticed are all slightly dull, and a seed catalog with the pages marked for what grows at altitude. She picked up her fork. I did my research, Elias. He sat with that for a moment. What kind of books? He asked. What? February was the hardest month, which was what Elias had told her to expect. The cold was not the dramatic violence of the November blizzard, but something colder in its way. A steady, implacable, grinding cold that came with iron skies and weeks without real sunlight, and a quality of silence that was different from November's silence. November's silence was new. February's silence was old. It had weight and duration and a kind of boredom to it that Naomi recognized as more dangerous than the drama of the storm. She'd seen it do something to Elias. He got quieter in February. Not unfriendly. He was never unfriendly. But he pulled slightly inward, and she understood without needing him to explain that this was what years of February alone had done. It had carved a groove in him. He defaulted to it without meaning to. She decided not to let him disappear into that groove entirely. She started reading aloud in the evenings. It was practical, she told herself. The firelight was better in the main room than at the table where she did close work, and if she was going to sit by the fire anyway, she might as well use the time. She'd started with one of the novels she'd brought. Nothing remarkable, a frontier story she'd liked well enough. And she'd read it to herself for 2 evenings before she looked up and caught Elias not reading his almanac, but listening, very quietly, from across the room. "I can read louder," she said. "I wasn't—" He stopped. "You were listening." He didn't deny it. After that, she read aloud to both of them, and he stopped pretending he was doing something else. And the February evenings acquired a shape that made the dark outside feel like something they were inside of together, rather than something pressing in from all sides. It was during one of these evenings, a Friday in the middle of February, with a light snow coming down outside, that he first touched her hand. It wasn't an event exactly. She'd stopped mid-page to use her finger to hold a place while she leaned over to adjust the lamp wick. And when she straightened back up, he'd reached over and simply turned the page for her, his hand moving across hers for just a moment. And then he'd withdrawn it, and she'd continued reading, and neither of them said anything. But something had shifted quietly, the way things shift on this mountain. Not all at once, but in layers. The trappers came back in March when the high road began to clear. Rudy Hask arrived first, which was predictable. Rudy was a man of habit. And he was more civil than he'd been in November, possibly because Naomi handed him coffee before he'd even gotten his coat off, and talked to him plainly about snowpack conditions on the North Face, which she'd been tracking in a log since December. He seemed surprised that she'd been tracking it. He seemed more surprised that her data matched his own observations. "You been keeping records?" he said, looking at the log. "Since the first week," she said. "Temperature, wind direction, precipitation. I wanted to understand the patterns." Rudy looked at the log for a moment, then looked at Elias. "She's more organized than you," he said. "Yes," Elias said. "That's not a criticism," Rudy said to Naomi. "Mercer's fine. He's just, he's Mercer." Naomi looked at Elias. Elias looked at the ceiling. Rudy drank his coffee. Fletcher Grouse came 3 days later, and he did not come alone. He came with 2 other men from the lower valley whose names Naomi didn't know, and from the moment they came through the door there was a different quality to the visit, a testing quality. The 3 of them spread out in the cabin, the way men do when they're deciding they own a space, taking up room, and Fletcher launched into a story about a trapper from the eastern settlement whose mail-order wife had left him in January, packed up and gone, couldn't take the winters, you know how it is. And he told this story to Elias while Naomi was present, but not by any formal acknowledgement there. "Seems like a pattern," Fletcher said, setting down his cup. "Women and these mountain arrangements. They try. They just can't hold." "Naomi's held through the worst 2 months of the year," Elias said. His voice was even. "So far," Fletcher said, and smiled the smile of a man who thinks he's being friendly. Naomi came out from the kitchen end of the room with the coffee pot. She refilled Fletcher's cup without being asked, and she refilled the cups of the 2 men whose names she didn't know. And then she set the pot down on the table and she stood with her hands folded, and she looked at Fletcher Grouse with the complete reading attention she'd given the mountain on the first day. "Mr. Grouse," she said. "Ma'am?" "I've been on this mountain since October. I've been through a 3-day blizzard, 2 secondary storms, 6 weeks of the worst cold in recent memory according to your own neighbor Rudy Hask, and I've still got a full root cellar and sound livestock, and a husband who hasn't had to do everything alone for the first time in as long as he can remember." She paused.
How long have you been married? Fletcher blinked. 14 years. And your wife, is she still there? Of course she's still. What kind of question is that? I'm just establishing the pattern, Naomi said pleasantly. You stay, she stays. Remarkable. Extraordinary. Almost like people who decide to stay tend to stay. One of the unnamed men made a sound that might have been a laugh, suppressed very quickly. Fletcher Grouse looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not quite angry, not quite embarrassed, somewhere in between. You've got a mouth on you, he said. I've been told, she said, and went back to the kitchen. After they left, Elias stood in the middle of the room for a moment. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know I didn't have to, she said. She was washing the cups. I wanted to. He's going to talk about it in the valley. He was going to talk about it in the valley regardless, she said. At least now he'll talk about something accurate. There was a pause. What he said about patterns, Elias started. Don't. She turned around. Her voice was firm but not sharp. Don't apologize for him and don't explain him. He's not your responsibility and his opinions are not something you need to carry. She looked at him steadily. I'm still here, Elias. That's the only pattern that matters. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. Check. It was 2 weeks after that, on a mild Thursday in late March, when the snow was softening on the south slope, and actual mud appeared in the yard for the first time since November, that a stranger came up the road in a coach. Not a wagon, a coach. Black lacquered wood, iron-rimmed wheels, a driver in a proper coat. It was an absurd vehicle for the Bitter Ridge Road, and the driver looked like he knew it, guiding the horses with the care of a man who'd been told this was important enough to risk a carriage axle. Naomi saw it from the yard where she was assessing the garden beds for the spring move. She watched it come up the road with a still, careful feeling she'd learned to trust. The feeling she got when something was presenting itself as one thing and was probably something else. The man who stepped out was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the territory in the way that money managed without quite fitting. The coat was too clean, the boots too new for anything above the tree line. He had the face of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room he walked into. He looked at the homestead with the particular look of a man who was calculating rather than seeing. Elias came around from the shed. Mr. Mercer, the man said. He didn't offer his hand immediately, which told Naomi something. My name is Garrett Sloan. I have a business proposition I think you'll find worth your time. Elias looked at him with the flat, steady expression he wore when he was being careful. All right, he said. Naomi stayed where she was by the garden beds, close enough to hear, not close enough to be included in the conversation unless she chose to insert herself. She made herself look occupied. She listened. Garrett Sloan's proposition was simple in structure and complicated in implication. He represented a timber company. He named it, some arrangement she didn't recognize, that was looking to open the upper valley for logging operations. The terrain required access through the pass, and the pass, it turned out, ran directly through the northeast corner of Elias's property. Sloan wanted to buy that corner, 50 acres, he said, a fair price, more than fair, he said, and named a figure that was in fact more than Elias could reasonably expect to see in several years of combined income from the homestead. Elias was quiet for a moment. The pass is the only practical route to my upper grazing land, he said. I sell you that corner. I'm cutting off access to a third of my property. You'd retain the right of way, Sloan said smoothly. It would be written into the deed. You'd still be able to cross. At your discretion, Elias said. A small pause. Within reasonable limits, yes. Elias looked at the man. No, he said. Sloane's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A slight shift, like a gear moving. Mr. Mercer, I understand the hesitation. This is your family's land, but I'd encourage you to think carefully. I don't need to think carefully, Elias said. The pass is part of this property. The property isn't for sale. Sloan nodded slowly, in the manner of a man who had expected this and had several next moves prepared. Well, he said, I appreciate your directness. Perhaps we can revisit this conversation once you've had some time. He looked around the homestead again with that calculating look. His eyes moved to Naomi at the garden beds, and he offered a brief, smooth smile. "Ma'am?" Then he got back into the coach.
They watched the coach make its laborious turn and head back down the road. Naomi came across the yard. "Timber company," she said. "Timber company," Elias confirmed. "He'll come back." "Yes." "He wasn't surprised that you said no," she said. "He'd expected it. He had the look of a man who had expected it and was already thinking about the next approach." Elias looked at her. "You were watching his face." "I was watching his face," she agreed. "He's done this before. The price was too specific, too fast. He'd already had someone assess this property. He knew what figure would feel like a windfall up here, and he led with it. That's not a man making an offer. That's a man softening a target." Elias was quiet for a moment. "What do we do?" he asked. It was the first time he'd said we about something like this. Not, "What should I do?" or "What would you do?" We. Naomi noticed it. She didn't say anything about it. "For now, nothing," she said. "We wait to see what the next approach looks like. And we talk to Boyd Connell, because if Sloan wants that pass badly enough to come up here in a lacquered coach on a mud road, he's probably already been to the other ridge properties too." "Boyd's not exactly—" "I know," she said. "Go anyway." Boyd Connell was a hard man to read, which Naomi had suspected from everything Elias had said about him, and confirmed when they rode out to the Connell place 2 days later. He was lean and weathered and careful with words, the kind of man who'd built his life around being obligated to no one, and he met them in the yard with the body language of a man who wasn't sure yet whether this visit was a convenience or an imposition. Vera Connell came out behind him and was immediately, practically warm. She was a small, capable woman with direct eyes and the bearing of someone who'd learned to run a frontier property with or without full cooperation. And she pulled Naomi toward the house almost immediately on the premise of coffee, which Naomi suspected was as much about giving Elias and Boyd space to talk as about hospitality. In the Connell kitchen, over coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, Vera said, "Garrett Sloan came to see us 2 weeks ago." "I know," Naomi said. "He came to us on Thursday." Vera looked at her steadily. "Boyd didn't say no." Naomi kept her face even. "He agreed to sell?" "He said he'd think about it." Vera wrapped her hands around her cup. "The money's real, Mrs. Mercer. I'm not going to pretend it isn't real. We've had 3 hard seasons, and the boys are growing, and Boyd's been carrying a bad knee all winter." She paused. "But I told him I didn't trust a man who arrived in a coach like that one." "What did he say?" "He said I was being difficult." Naomi looked at her coffee. "What does Sloan want with the Connell land?" "Same as yours, near as we can tell. The ridge road comes through our south corner. Boyd's corner and your husband's corner together effectively control the only practical access to the upper valley." Vera paused. "Separately, each piece is useful. Together, they're the door." Naomi sat with that. "If Boyd sells his corner and Elias holds," she said slowly, "Sloan gets half a door. He can pressure us then from both sides. The timber operations would border us directly, and the road would be under his control enough to complicate our access." "That's what I said to Boyd," Vera told her. "He said I was being difficult again." "What would change his mind?" Vera looked at her for a long moment. There was something measuring in the look, but not unfriendly. More like a woman deciding how much of the truth to use. "Boyd doesn't trust people easily," she said. "He especially doesn't trust arrangements that benefit him and someone else at the same time. He always thinks the other person's getting the better end." She paused. "But he respects people who are straight with him, who don't handle him." Another pause. "He's been not unkind exactly in what he's said about you, about your arriving here." Naomi understood what not unkind exactly meant. "Has he changed his thinking?" she asked. "He watched you brace that lean-to in the November storm," Vera said. "Our boys were up on the ridge that afternoon and they saw you working. Boyd didn't say anything when they told him, but he got a particular look." She paused. "He doesn't give that look easily."
It wasn't a promise of anything, but it was information. Naomi finished her coffee and thought about the lacquered coach and Garrett Sloane's too fast, too specific offer, and the calculating look he'd turned on their homestead. She thought about Vera Connell's hands tight around her cup, and Boyd's bad knee, and 3 hard seasons, and the way a man like Sloane would know exactly which pressures to apply and in which order. She thought about the pass that ran through the northeast corner of their property, the only practical route to the upper valley. The door. Outside, through the Connell kitchen window, she could see Elias and Boyd Connell standing in the yard. They weren't talking much, but they were both looking up at the ridge, at the same piece of high ground from different angles, and there was something in the shared direction of their gaze that was, she thought, a beginning. Not a solution, just a beginning. She looked at Vera. "I think," Naomi said carefully, "that you and I should talk about what the spring looks like before Sloane comes back." Vera nodded. She got up and refilled both cups without asking. "I thought you might say that," she said. The conversation with Vera Connell stayed with Naomi the whole ride back. Elias drove the mule at the pace the road allowed, which wasn't fast, the spring mud still deep in the ruts from the thaw, and Naomi sat beside him on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap and her mind moving through what she knew and what she suspected and what she couldn't yet see. The mountain was showing its first color in months. The south-facing slopes had patches of brown grass visible beneath the retreating snow, and the creek that ran alongside the lower road was running fast and loud with melt, and it looked briefly like a place that could be generous. She didn't trust that impression. Not yet. "Boyd said anything to you?" she asked. "About Sloane?" Elias kept his eyes on the road. "He said a man who arrives in a coach like that one doesn't come just once." "He's right about that." "He also said the figure Sloane quoted him was higher than what Sloane quoted us." Naomi looked at him. "How much higher?" 20%. She turned that over. "He's dividing us," she said, "offering Boyd more so Boyd feels like he's getting the better arrangement. So if we compare notes, Boyd feels like he'd be a fool to say no." "That's what I thought." "Did you tell Boyd that?" "I told him I thought Sloane had done his arithmetic carefully and that the arithmetic was designed to produce a specific result." Elias paused. "Boyd told me he'd been buying and selling on this ridge for 15 years and he didn't need a man 6 months off the flatlands explaining arithmetic to him." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. "How did you leave it?" "He said he hadn't decided. Vera gave me a look over his shoulder that I think meant she was working on it." "She is," Naomi said. "She's smarter than he gives her credit for." "Most men's wives are," Elias said, in a tone so plain and unornamented that it took Naomi a moment to realize it was, in its way, a compliment aimed somewhere in her direction. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was watching the road, but she felt it land quietly. She looked at the mud track ahead of them and the dark line of pines on the ridge and the pale spring sky above all of it. "Sloane will come back before summer," she said, "and the next time he comes, he won't just make an offer." "What do you mean?" "He's not a man who accepts a first no," she said. "He came up here in that coach because he'd already decided we'd sell. When we didn't, he recalibrated. He'll come back with something different, not a higher price or not only that. He'll come back with pressure." She paused. "We need to know what we're standing on before he does." "We're standing on our own land," Elias said. "We need to know if we're standing on it legally," she said. "When was the deed last registered?" A pause. 7 years ago, he said, "when I filed the original homestead claim. Has the boundary been surveyed since?" He was quiet for a moment too long. "Elias, the northeast corner was surveyed in the original claim," he said carefully. "But there was a question at the time about the upper boundary line. The territory surveyor marked it provisionally. I was told it would be confirmed in the next county survey cycle." "And was it?" The wagon moved through a long rut and lurched, and he steadied the mule before he answered. "I don't know," he said. Naomi breathed out slowly through her nose. "We need to find out. The county land office is in Aldervale. Then we go to Aldervale," she said, "this week." They went on Wednesday, which was the earliest the road was dry enough to make the trip practical. Aldervale was a genuine town, not large but real,
with a proper main street and a post office and a land registry office, in a building that smelled like old paper and damp wood, and had a clerk named Purvis who wore spectacles and moved through his filing system with the careful, proprietary attention of a man who considered the documents his personal charges. Purvis found the Mercer homestead claim in under 10 minutes, which spoke well of his organization, and spread the relevant papers on the counter with the satisfaction of a man revealing something he already knew. The original claim was solid. The southwest, southeast, and northwest corners were clearly surveyed and recorded. The northeast corner had a notation in the margin in faded ink, Boundary Provisional Pending Confirmatory Survey, Refra TR County Cycle, 1871. Was the confirmatory survey done? Naomi asked. Purvis looked at her over his spectacles. He'd been looking at Elias when he spoke, the way men in offices often defaulted to the husband, and Naomi had been letting it go because the goal was information, not correction. Ma'am? The 1871 county survey cycle. Was this boundary confirmed? Purvis went back to his files. He was gone longer this time, nearly 20 minutes, and when he came back, he had a second folder and an expression that was professionally neutral in the way that meant the news was not straightforwardly good. The 1871 cycle covered most of the upper county, he said, placing the folder on the counter. The northeast Mercer boundary was scheduled. It was not, however. He turned a page. It was not completed. The surveyor's notes indicate access was impeded by early snow. There's a notation that it would be carried forward to the next cycle. Which was when? Naomi asked. 1876. And? Purvis turned another page. His expression shifted slightly. Just slightly, but she caught it. There is a survey of that area in the 1876 records, he said. However, the surveyor who completed it was a Mr. Arlo Fitch a pause, whose work in several upper county parcels was subsequently called into question. There were irregularities in his methods. The word irregularities settled in the room like a stone dropped in still water. What kind of irregularities? Elias said. Purvis looked at him. Then, apparently deciding that full disclosure was going to emerge one way or another, he said, Mr. Fitch was found to have accepted payment from land interests to mark boundaries in ways favorable to those interests. He was removed from the county surveyor rolls in 1878. Several of his surveys were invalidated. Others were reviewed and found acceptable. He paused. The Mercer northeast boundary was surveyed by Mr. Fitch in 1876. The silence in the land office was complete, except for the tick of the clock on the wall behind Purvis's head. Has it been reviewed? Naomi asked. I have no record of a formal review of this particular boundary, Purvis said, meaning it could be invalid. Meaning its legal standing is uncertain. Elias put both hands flat on the counter. His jaw was set, and he was looking at the papers with the expression of a man confronting a problem he'd unknowingly been living inside of for years. If the northeast boundary is uncertain, Naomi said slowly, then the exact location of the pass relative to our property is uncertain. That would be a fair characterization, Purvis said. She looked at Elias. He was still looking at the papers. Sloan knows, she said. He looked at her. He knows, she said again. That's why he came in that coach. That's why the offer was too fast and too specific. He's already had someone look at these records. He knows the northeast boundary is soft, and he's planning to use that, either to argue the pass was never firmly within our deed, or to commission a new survey with a surveyor who will find the boundary where he wants it. Can he do that? Elias asked Purvis. Purvis chose his words with the careful precision of a man who had opinions but was not paid to have them publicly. A party with standing could petition for a boundary review, he said. The outcome of such a review would depend on the quality of evidence presented. And if he presents more money than we can counter, Naomi said. Purvis said nothing, which was an answer. She stood at the counter and looked at the papers and thought with the rapid, practical clarity that came over her when things were urgent. The needle and thread logic, she thought of it privately, finding the path through, stitch by stitch, when the material was tangled. We need to commission our own survey, she said. A proper one, from a surveyor whose record is clean before Sloan can move. If we have our own documented boundary on record, A petition from him becomes a contest between two surveys rather than a petition into a void. Cost? Elias asked Purvis. Purvis named a figure. It was not catastrophic, but it was real. Real enough that she saw Elias's hands press slightly harder on the counter. When can we get someone up there? She asked. I can recommend a Mr. Aldous Crane, Purvis said. He's the most reliable surveyor working this county currently. His schedule, he thought. I believe he could be available within 3 weeks, given the thaw. Book him, Naomi said. Elias looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression that said, We'll figure out the money. That's a smaller problem than the alternative. He turned back to Purvis. Book him, he said. 3 weeks was long enough for Garrett Sloan to make his next move, which arrived not as a visit but as a letter. It came through the Valley Post Rider on a Tuesday, addressed to Elias in handwriting too clean to be anything but a professional hand paid by someone else. The letter was polite, formal, and contained a revised offer, higher than the first, along with a paragraph that Naomi read 3 times before she let herself respond to it. The paragraph said that Sloan's legal representatives had reviewed the property records for the Mercer homestead and identified certain questions regarding the northeastern boundary survey, and that these questions raised the possibility that the land in question, the 50 acres including the pass, might not be firmly within the Mercer deed, and that given this uncertainty, Sloan was prepared to offer a resolution that would settle the matter cleanly for all parties. He's moving faster than I expected, Elias said. He found out about Purvis, Naomi said. Someone in that office talks, or he had someone watching. What do we do with this? Nothing yet. She folded the letter and set it on the table with the deliberateness of someone setting aside a thing they intend to deal with properly. We wait for Crane to complete the survey. We don't respond to Sloan before then. She paused. And we need to tell Boyd Connell about this letter. Boyd's not going to want... Boyd needs to know that Sloan is using legal language now, she said. Because if Sloan is questioning our boundary, he may be questioning Boyd's as well. The Connell south corner touches the same road. She looked at him steadily. Boyd Connell may not like us much, but he likes Garrett Sloan less if he understands what Sloan is actually doing. Elias picked up his coffee, drank it, set it back down. You want to ride out there tomorrow? I want to ride out there this afternoon, she said. Boyd Connell read the letter in his yard with the focused, frowning attention of a man who didn't want to be alarmed and was becoming alarmed. Vera stood at his shoulder and read it too, and when Boyd looked up, his expression was not warm, but it was different from the last time Naomi had seen it. The casual dismissal had been replaced by something more engaged, more uncomfortable. He's claiming the survey's bad, Boyd said. He's claiming it's uncertain, Naomi said, which is slightly different but produces the same result for him. My boundary was done in the same period, Boyd said. He was looking at the letter still, not at her. I know, she said. Could be Fitch did mine too. It's possible, she said. That's why I'm here. If Sloan can argue that both our northeast boundaries are soft, he can potentially claim the pass corridor belongs to neither of us, that it falls in unregistered territory, which means he petitions the county for a fresh claim on that corridor as unclaimed land. The silence in the Connell yard was broken only by the sound of the creek running hard with snowmelt. That son of a bitch, Boyd said quietly. It was, Naomi thought, the most useful thing Boyd Connell had said in her presence. We've commissioned Aldous Crane to survey our northeast line, she said. He starts in 2 weeks. If your boundary has the same issue, you should commission him for yours at the same time. 2 clean surveys registered together are harder to contest than one. Boyd looked at her. The direct assessing look of a man who had spent years deciding who to trust and mostly decided on nobody. That's going to cost, he said. Yes, she said. And you're asking me to spend money I wasn't planning to spend because of a problem I didn't know I had until 2 minutes ago. I'm telling you about the problem, she said. What you do about it is your decision. Another silence. Why? Boyd said. Why come tell me? She looked at him without flinching. Because you're our closest neighbor, and if Sloan gets that corridor, he'll have leverage over every property on this ridge, including yours. Because the pass affects all of us, not just us. She paused. And because I'm not interested in winning this by letting our neighbor lose. That's not a win. Boyd looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Vera. Vera said nothing. She didn't need to. The look she gave him was the particular look of a woman who has been saying something for weeks and is now watching events confirm it, and Boyd Connell, for all his difficult edges, was a man who knew his wife's looks. Get Crane to do both boundaries, he said finally. I'll pay my share. Aldous Crane arrived on a Thursday in mid-April, a compact, methodical man in his 50s who spoke very little and measured everything twice and had the irreproachable professional reputation of someone who had spent a long career being scrupulously uninteresting. He spent 2 full days on the Mercer Northeast boundary and 1 day on the Connell South corner, and he did his work with the quiet precision of a man to whom accuracy was not a virtue, but simply the only available option. His preliminary findings, delivered on the evening of the 3rd day over supper at Elias's table, were careful and exact. The original provisional boundary from the first Mercer survey was substantively correct, he said. Fitch's 1876 survey had introduced a deviation, small but deliberate in his professional opinion, that shifted the northeastern corner approximately 40 feet southwest of where the original markers indicated it should be. This deviation placed the eastern edge of the pass corridor just outside the Mercer deed as Fitch had drawn it. 40 feet, Elias said. 41, precisely. Crane pulled out his field notes and laid them on the table. The deviation is consistent with what I've seen in Fitch's other invalidated work. It's not a measurement error. The angles are too clean. He tapped the notes. In plain terms, Mr. Mercer, someone paid Fitch to draw your corner 41 feet wrong. Can you correct it? Naomi asked. I can document the original markers and the deviation and submit a formal correction to the county record, Crane said. The correction would supersede Fitch's survey. Your boundary would be restored to the original claim. How long to get that on record? I can have the documentation filed in Aldervale within the week. Naomi looked at Elias across the table. He was looking at the field notes with the expression of a man who was angry, genuinely angry, a slow, cold kind, but holding it. File it, he said. Crane nodded and reached for the bread Naomi had set out, and the conversation moved to the practical details of the filing, and Naomi filled his coffee cup and listened and let the relief settle into her quietly, without making anything of it. Garrett Sloan arrived for his second visit on a Saturday morning in late April, and this time he brought a man with him who was introduced as his land agent and who carried a leather case that had the look of someone who expected to produce papers from it. He found Elias in the yard, which was where Elias had been for the past hour, knowing from the sound of the coach on the lower road that it was coming. Naomi was visible through the open cabin door, seated at the table. She didn't come out immediately. Sloan was warmer this time, more expansive. He spoke about the beauty of the property and the quality of the spring and the hard work evident in the expanded garden beds. Naomi had already begun relocating them to the east side as she'd planned, and he worked his way to the point with the practiced ease of a man who believed sincerity was a tactical option. Mr. Mercer, he said, I think our previous conversations may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I want to be straightforward with you today. All right, Elias said. There are some questions about the boundary on your northeast corner, Sloan said, and I don't think it benefits either of us to let those questions sit unresolved. What I'm proposing, he nodded to the land agent who opened the case, is a clean resolution. My company would commission a proper survey of the disputed area at our expense, and whatever that survey shows would settle the boundary once and for all. In exchange, the boundary isn't disputed, Elias said. Sloan paused. I beg your pardon? It was surveyed by Aldous Crane, Elias said. The correction is filed at the Aldervale Land Office. The northeast corner of this property is documented and on record as of Wednesday morning. The land agent's hand stopped moving in the leather case. Sloan looked at Elias. The warmth in his expression didn't disappear exactly. It was more like it became structural rather than genuine, something held in place by professional habit while the mind behind it recalculated. That was fast, he said. Yes, Elias said. A pause. And the Connell South corner? Sloan said, in a slightly more careful tone. Filed the same day, Naomi said from the cabin door. Both men turned. She was standing in the doorway with her arms folded and her expression even, and she looked at Garrett Sloan with the complete, unhurried attention she had always given to things that needed to be accurately understood. Crane found the deviation in both surveys, she said. Both corrections are on record. The pass corridor is inside the Mercer northeastern boundary, clear and documented. She paused. I imagine your land agent can verify that at the registry office if you'd like to make the trip. Sloan looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who'd clearly built a great deal of his professional success on reading situations and adjusting to them faster than the other party, and she could see him reading this one, reading that the approach he'd brought up this road was not going to produce what he'd planned, that the ground he'd expected to be soft was solid, that the two properties he'd intended to divide had instead, apparently, aligned. Your wife, he said to Elias, in the tone of a man conceding a point he'd prefer not to concede. My wife, Elias said. Sloan looked at Naomi once more. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He took his leather case from the land agent and put it under his arm. I may come back with a different proposition, he said, when the survey business is settled. The survey business is settled, Naomi said. Sloan smiled, the professional smile, the one that didn't quite reach his eyes, and walked back to the coach. They watched it turn and go back down the road, and when the sound of the wheels faded into the pines below, Elias stood in the yard with his hands at his sides, and the spring sun coming down on the mud and the new grass showing at the edges of the track. He's not done, Naomi said from the doorway. No, Elias said, but we held. We held the survey, she said. That's one thing. She wasn't trying to diminish it. It was real, what they'd done. She just knew Sloan well enough by now to know it wasn't finished. Come inside, coffee's still hot. He turned from the road and came across the yard, and she stepped back from the door to let him in. And as he passed her in the narrow doorway, he stopped, just for a moment, close enough that she could see the mud dried on his jacket collar and the particular set of his jaw that meant he was thinking something he wasn't sure he knew how to say. Thank you, he said, for the survey, for Crane, for going to Purvis, and all of it. I didn't see it coming. She looked at him. You would have, Ian, she said. You just didn't have someone to look with you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved inside and she followed, and the door closed against the April wind. And through the east-facing window, the morning light came in clean and level across the floor of the cabin. That was slowly, month by month, becoming the kind of place that felt different when you were inside it than it did when you were out. Not because of anything dramatic, just because it had two people in it who were learning, steadily and imperfectly, how to look at the same horizon together. Garrett Sloan would come back. She was certain of that. And when he did, he would come with something she hadn't yet anticipated, because that was the kind of man he was. She poured the coffee and looked out the east window at the spring mountain and thought about what she hadn't yet anticipated, and the thinking didn't frighten her. It just made her pay attention. Sloan came back in June, not in the lacquered coach this time. He came on horseback, alone, which was either a gesture of good faith or a calculated signal that he understood the previous approach hadn't worked and was trying something different. Naomi watched him come up the road from the garden where she was setting the relocated beds, and she noted the horse, instead of the coach, the same way she noted everything, without reaction, just filing it, turning it over to understand what it meant. He found Elias at the woodpile, and he didn't ask to come inside this time. He stood in the yard and he made his third offer, and the third offer was not about buying land. It was about a road agreement. He explained it calmly and with less performance than the previous visits. His company was willing to abandon any claim to the pass corridor, he said. He acknowledged, without quite saying so directly, that the survey situation had made the previous approach untenable. What he wanted now was simpler, a legal right-of-way for timber vehicles to use the pass road during logging season, April through October, in exchange for a significant annual payment to both the Mercer and Connell properties. It was structurally a reasonable offer. Naomi knew that. She stood at the edge of the garden with her hands dirty from planting and listened to him present it, and felt the pull of the reasonableness. Because the money was real, and the road agreement would not, on its face, require them to give up anything they'd fought to hold. She also noted that Elias had not immediately said no. That was different. After Sloan left, he didn't press for an answer, which itself was a signal that he'd learned something from his previous mistakes. Elias stood in the yard and looked at the road for a while. It's not the worst thing he's offered, he said. No, Naomi agreed. The money would let us expand the cabin, maybe put up a second structure for storage. Yes. He looked at her. You don't like it. I haven't said that. You haven't said anything, which is the same thing with you. She almost smiled. He'd learned to read her, somewhere in the months between October and June, and she hadn't entirely noticed it happening until moments like this one, when he used the knowledge with a casualness that meant it had become natural. She pulled off her planting gloves and looked at the pass road where it disappeared into the upper pines. If we allow logging vehicles through that pass from April to October, she said, we lose quiet season. The animals won't like the traffic. The road will deteriorate faster than Sloane's maintenance agreement will cover. I guarantee it. And the moment we have a legal arrangement with his company, we have a legal relationship with his company, which means lawyers and contracts and disputes about what the terms mean. She paused. And once a company like that has a foot in the door of this valley, the foot gets bigger. It always does. Elias was quiet. But, she said. He looked at her. But we should talk to Boyd before we decide either way, because if Boyd takes the agreement and we don't, Sloane gets the corridor access through the Connell south corner anyway, just from a different angle, and we've held our principle and gotten nothing for it. They rode to the Connell place the next morning. Boyd Connell had already received his own version of the offer, delivered by letter, and he and Vera were at the kitchen table with it spread out in front of them when Elias and Naomi arrived. The atmosphere in the kitchen was the atmosphere of two people who had been arguing about the same thing for 12 hours and had arrived at something just short of resolution. Vera thinks we should take it, Boyd said without preamble. Vera thinks we should consider it, Vera said, with the precision of a woman who had chosen her words carefully. There's a difference. What do you think? Naomi asked Boyd. He looked at her. It was still not the look of a man who'd made his peace with her entirely, but it was different from the yard in March. Less guarded, more direct. She'd noticed the shift happening gradually, not from any single event, but from the accumulation of small things. The survey, the way she'd come to him directly, the fact that she hadn't claimed credit for what Crane had found, but had simply made sure it helped both properties equally. I think the money's real, Boyd said. I think the pass access is real. And I think that if we say no and Sloane finds another way into that valley, through the low route, if he gets a crew to clear it, then we've said no and gotten nothing, and he's in anyway. The low route would cost him 3 times what the pass costs, Naomi said, but he could do it. He could, she agreed, but not this season. The low route through the eastern drainage is at least 2 years of clearing work before it's passable for logging vehicles. Which means, if we hold now, we hold from a position where he needs us more than he's admitting. Boyd looked at the letter. You want a counter? I want to understand what we're actually worth to him before we agree to anything, she said. Because right now we're negotiating against his first reasonable offer and we don't know where his ceiling is. And if we push and he walks away, then he spends 2 years and triple the money on the low route, Naomi said. And we've lost nothing but a deal we didn't fully need. Vera looked at her husband. Boyd looked at the letter. He picked it up and set it down again, which was a gesture she was coming to recognize as the thing he did when he'd made up his mind but wasn't ready to say so yet. What do you want to counter with? He asked. What? The counter went to Sloane through Purvis at the land office, written out in careful, plain language that Naomi had drafted at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, with Elias reading over her shoulder, and Boyd Connell's amendment added at the bottom, where Vera had signed it alongside Boyd because Vera had quietly insisted. The counter was not aggressive, it was specific. A higher annual payment, indexed to logging volume rather than a flat rate so that a productive season paid more and a poor one paid less. A road maintenance bond held by the county that Sloane's company would forfeit if the road condition fell below a defined standard, a hard cap on vehicle weight to protect the road surface, a seasonal buffer at either end, no traffic before May 1st and nothing after September 15th, and a non-expansion clause that limited the agreement to the existing pass road and explicitly excluded any claim to additional access through either property. It was, as Elias said when she read it to him the second evening, thorough. It's also going to annoy him, he said. It's going to tell us how badly he wants this, she said. If he walks away from these terms, the low route was always his plan, and this was theater. If he accepts or counters seriously, then we know the pass is essential to his timeline. Sloan did not walk away. He countered on 2 points, the maintenance bond amount and the vehicle weight cap, and his counter was close enough to their terms that Naomi knew, reading the response letter at the kitchen table on a warm July morning with the east window open and the sound of the mule in the yard and Elias pouring coffee behind her, that the pass road was essential to him, and he'd known it all along, and all his previous approaches had been attempts to get what he needed without paying what it was worth. She wrote back accepting his counter on the bond amount and holding firm on the weight cap. He accepted. The agreement was signed at the Aldervale Land Office in August, with Purvis as witness and Boyd Connell standing stiff and formal in his good shirt on one side of Elias and Vera on the other side of Naomi, and all of them signing in turn, and Sloan across the table with his professional expression and his professional handshake, and the look underneath both of a man who respected what had happened, even if he hadn't enjoyed it. Afterward, in the street outside the land office, Boyd Connell stood beside Naomi in the August heat and looked at the signed copy of the agreement in his hand. "You know what you did in there," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I know what we did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been on this ridge for 11 years, he said. "Sloan, or someone like him, has been circling these properties since before I got here. Nobody ever—" He stopped, started again. "You've been here less than a year." 9 months, she said. 9 months. He turned the agreement over in his hand. How'd you know he'd come back with something reasonable instead of just pushing harder? She thought about it honestly. "I didn't know," she said. "I thought he probably would, because the low route was going to cost him real money, and he's not the type to spend real money when he can spend pressure instead. But I didn't know." Boyd looked at her. "That's an honest answer." "I try," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small movement, barely there, but genuine. "Vera likes you," he said. "She told me a month ago that you were the most practically useful person she'd met on this ridge." "Vera's generous." "Vera's not generous at all," he said. "That's the thing about it." He folded the agreement and put it in his jacket and walked to where Vera was waiting with the wagon. And Naomi watched him go and felt something ease in her that had been held tense since March, since the lacquered coach and the too specific offer and the first cold understanding of what Sloan was actually doing. Autumn came back to Bitter Ridge the way it always did, on the back of the first cold wind off the upper peaks in September, and with it came the particular annual reckoning of preparation. The 5th cord of wood was already stacked, had been stacked since August this time because Naomi had moved the cutting schedule up by 3 weeks, and Elias had not argued. The root cellar was full. The relocated garden had produced, in its first proper season in the East Light, nearly double what the south beds had managed in 3 years combined, which neither of them made much of explicitly, but which sat between them as a quiet, solid fact. The cabin itself was different. Elias had added to it over the summer, a real addition this time, properly planned and built. A second room off the east side that doubled the floor space and had 2 real windows and enough room for a proper table where 2 people could work at the same time without constantly being in each other's way. Boyd Connell had come over for 3 days to help with the heavy framing, and Fletcher Grouse, of all people, had shown up with his 2 sons on a Saturday in July to help raise the roof, because the word had gotten around about the Sloan agreement, and Fletcher had arrived with boards and his sons in a manner that was not quite an apology, but was as close to one as Fletcher Grouse probably came. Naomi had fed all of them and said nothing about the November visit, and the things Fletcher had said with her standing 8 feet away, and Fletcher had eaten 2 bowls of stew and told Elias, loud enough to carry, that his wife made a damn fine stew, which was, by Fletcher Grouse's standards, essentially a formal act of contrition. She'd accepted it as such, quietly, without making him perform more of it. The trading stop had been Elias's idea, which still surprised her a little. He'd brought it up in July, when the pass road was seeing more legitimate traffic than usual. Travelers crossing the ridge, a few mining supply wagons heading north, the occasional family making the crossing to the upper settlements. And he'd said, without much preamble, that there might be something in offering a rest stop with water and basic supplies at the Mercer property, given that they sat at roughly the halfway point on the pass. She'd looked at him when he said it. He'd looked back steadily. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since June, roughly," he admitted. "Why didn't you say something?" "I wasn't sure it was practical." "It's practical," she said immediately. "We'd need to build a small structure. Nothing large, just a covered area with a water trough and maybe a shelf for basic goods. We'd need to maintain a stock of things travelers actually need, not things we think they need. Salt, rope, lamp oil, basic medicine." She paused. "We'd need to be there when they come through, or have a system for when we're not." "I know," he said. I thought you might want to run it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why me?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered things. "Because you're better with people than I am," he said. I don't mean it as a criticism of myself. I just mean it's true. You read what people need faster than I do. You'd know what to stock and how to set a fair price and when someone's trying to cheat you." A pause. "And I thought you might want something that was yours, not just ours." It was, without question, the most perceptive thing he had ever said to her. She sat with it for a moment, the understanding that he'd seen something she hadn't fully articulated even to herself, that she loved what they'd built together genuinely, but that she was also a woman who'd spent a decade with her name on nothing, whose labor had always been in service of someone else's enterprise, and that some part of her, beneath the practical daily business of building this life, had wanted something she could point to and say, "That is mine. I made that decision, and I built that thing." "Yes," she said, "I would." The trading stop went up in early September, rough and simple, 3 walls and a roof and a wide shelf and a water trough with a gravity feed from the upper creek. And the first traveler stopped on the second day, a trapper moving north who needed lamp oil and paid without complaint, and told her, on his way out, that it was good to see a proper stop on this road. She watched him ride away and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific satisfaction of a thing she had made from a decision that was purely hers. Garrett Sloan honored the agreement through the first logging season, which Naomi had not entirely expected. His crews used the pass from May through September, and the road held because the weight cap held, and the maintenance bond remained intact because Sloan's company, whatever else it was careful about legal exposure. At the end of September, the crews pulled back below the tree line, and the pass went quiet again, and Bitter Ridge returned to the deep, working peace of pre-winter. Sloan himself came through in October, on horseback again, alone, almost exactly a year after his first visit in the lacquered coach. He stopped at the trading stop, and Naomi was there stocking the shelf, and he tipped his hat and asked for lamp oil, and she sold it to him at the standard price. He looked at the setup with the assessing eye that was simply his natural way of looking at things. "You built this," he said. "We did," she said. "Doing well?" "Well enough," she said. He paid and settled back in the saddle and looked at her with an expression that was not warm, but was, she thought, genuine. The look of a man who had been beaten at a game he was good at and had arrived, somewhere in the month since, at a grudging recognition of it. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "you should know that I've had dealings across 8 counties in this territory. Settlements, mining claims, timber access. I've dealt with a great many people." She waited. "You're the only person who ever made me go back and revise my approach 3 times, he said. "I'm flattered," she said, in a tone that was not entirely unserious. Something shifted in his expression, almost very briefly, something like amusement. He rode on up the pass road. She watched him go and then went back to the shelf, and that was the last time Garrett Sloan came to Bitter Ridge in any capacity that was not strictly contractual. The second winter on Bitter Ridge was harder than the first in terms of raw weather and easier in every other way. They had more wood, more preserved food, a root cellar that had been properly insulated and held its temperature through even the worst cold. A cabin large enough to move around in without the constant minor friction of 2 people sharing a space designed for one. And they had, by the time December came, a way of being together that had settled into something neither dramatic nor fragile, the way a joint can settle into a socket, finding the position it's actually meant to occupy. It wasn't a perfect thing. Elias still pulled inward in February, and she still had days when the isolation pressed on her in ways that city-bred instincts couldn't fully override. When the silence felt too large, and the mountain felt too permanent, and she missed, unreasonably, the specific quality of noise that a crowded street makes at mid-morning. She didn't always tell him when those days came. Sometimes she didn't have to. He'd bring her something practical, a task with her hands, the kind of work that quieted the part of her brain that was making too much noise. He'd learned that about her. She'd learned that when his mood darkened in the long, flat weeks of February, the thing that helped was not conversation but company, just being in the same room, the lamp burning, both of them doing something, not talking particularly, just not alone. They had arguments about money and about how much risk to take on with the trading stop, and about whether to take in a stray dog that appeared at the cabin door in January in a condition that made Naomi want to immediately bring it inside and made Elias immediately want to explain why that was impractical. They took in the dog. It was impractical for about 2 weeks, and then it became part of the property in the way animals do when they've decided they're staying, and Elias, who had opposed it, was the one who fed it without being reminded. She didn't bring that up either. There were small victories you kept private, not because you were afraid to share them, but because their value was in the knowing, not the telling. Vera Connell came for coffee every few weeks when the road allowed, and gradually those visits became something Naomi looked forward to with the specific pleasure of a friendship that had no performance in it. Two women who'd chosen the same hard terrain and understood each other from the inside without having to explain. Vera was drier and more sardonic than she appeared on first meeting, and she had opinions about everything and delivered them with the precision of someone who'd had to be economical with her words for a long time. Naomi liked her enormously. Boyd, for his part, had settled into a manner toward Naomi that was not warm, exactly, but was respectful in the particular way that men like Boyd Connell showed respect, by treating her as someone worth being straight with, which was, from him, a great deal. The trading stop, through its first winter, served 43 travelers. It was not a fortune, but it was something Naomi tracked carefully and understood completely, and by March she knew exactly what moved fastest and what sat on the shelf too long, and what price the traffic on that road would bear, and what it wouldn't. She'd written it all down in the same log where she'd tracked the winter weather conditions, and the log had grown into something she hadn't entirely expected, a practical record of how a mountain pass moved in seasons, what it needed, what it gave back. She didn't think of it as remarkable. It was just paying attention, which was something she'd always known how to do. In the spring of the second year, a letter arrived from Hector Briggs in Aldervale. It was short and characteristically plain. Briggs was not a man who wasted ink on sentiment, and it said that he'd had 2 inquiries recently from women interested in mountain homestead arrangements, and that he'd recommended they write to Naomi directly if she was willing to correspond, because he thought her perspective would be useful and honest in ways that his brokerage description necessarily couldn't be. He'd added a postscript. I should have sent you to Mercer first, not 7th. I apologize for the delay. Naomi read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning light from the east window, the same east window she'd noticed on the first day for its light. And she thought about the 6 women who'd come up this road before her, Dorothea with her rationed books, the widow from Ohio who'd packed her trunk fast, the sisters who'd fled from a bear at the woodpile. She didn't think they'd been weak. She'd never thought that. The mountain was genuinely hard and the isolation was genuinely heavy, and Elias, before she'd arrived, before he'd had someone to build beside him, had been a man shaped entirely by solitude in ways that must have made him difficult to reach. She understood why each of them had left. She understood it without judgment. What she'd had, coming up that road, wasn't toughness exactly. It wasn't a higher tolerance for hardship. It was something more specific. She'd been a woman who had nothing romantic in her expectations. She hadn't come looking for a story. She'd come looking for a life, a particular, concrete, daily bread kind of life that required work and offered exactly as much as you put in and no more. She'd already known what it felt like to put everything into something and have the something not be enough. She'd done that in the city, in the garment shop, in the tenement with the drafty walls, in the life that had steadily revealed itself as a place where she didn't quite fit no matter how hard she tried. The mountain had not cared whether she fit, That was what she'd understood on the first day and what she'd held on to through every hard thing since. The mountain wasn't going to welcome her. It wasn't going to reject her either. It was simply going to be what it was. And she was simply going to be what she was. And the question was only whether she could build something real inside that honest indifference. She could. She had. She wrote back to Briggs that afternoon and told him to have the women write, and she'd correspond honestly with both of them about what the life required and what it gave back. And she would not make it sound better than it was or worse than it was, because neither of them deserved anything but the plain truth of it. She also wrote, at the bottom of the letter, something she hadn't planned to write, but which came out of whatever place honest things come from. The hardest thing about this life is not the cold or the work or the isolation. The hardest thing is arriving without expectation and discovering that the absence of expectation is actually the only thing that makes it possible. Most people can't do that. They come here hoping to find something, and what's here is not what they hoped for. What's here is just the real thing. Ordinary, hard, occasionally beautiful, mostly just demanding. You have to want the real thing specifically, not the idea of it. The women who write to me should know that before they write. She read it back. She left it in. Elias read it over her shoulder when she was folding the letter, which he did sometimes. Read what she'd written without being invited and without apologizing for it, because that was the kind of intimacy that had developed between them, gradual and unannounced. He was quiet for a moment. "That's the truest thing I've read about this place," he said. "It's what I would have wanted someone to tell me," she said. "Would it have changed anything if someone had told you?" She folded the letter and looked at the east window, at the spring mountain coming back to life on the upper slopes, the gray granite still there underneath the new color, permanent and indifferent and entirely itself. "No," she said, "but it would have meant I arrived knowing what I was choosing, instead of having to figure it out after." He put his hand on the table beside hers, not on top of hers, just beside it, close enough to feel. "I'm glad you came anyway," he said. She looked at his hand next to hers on the table. She thought about the wagon ride up the mountain road and the frozen yard and the single chair by the stove and the draft in the north wall and the 7 women, 6 before her, and the one who'd stayed, and everything that had happened in the months between October and now. And she thought about how none of it had been easy and all of it had been worth it, not because the hard things had led to something good, but because the hard things and the good things were the same things, experienced differently depending on which way you were facing. She turned her hand over and put it on top of his. "Me too," she said. Outside, the mountain was doing what it always did, indifferent, enormous, entirely itself. The creek ran loud with snowmelt. The dog was barking at something at the edge of the tree line. Smoke came up clean and straight from the chimney into the cold spring air. The place that had broken 6 women and been written off by everyone who thought they understood what a person needed to survive. It was just a homestead. A solid one now. A producing one. A place where 2 people had shown up imperfect and stayed anyway, and in the staying had made something that hadn't existed before. Not a fairy tale. Not a rescue. Just 2 people, a mountain, and the daily, unglamorous, irreplaceable work of choosing the same thing twice. Once when you arrive, and once every morning after, when you get up and build the fire and start again. That's the part the stories never tell you. The first choice is the easy one.